Well, welcome again to the Court of History. The court is now in session. Don't forget to subscribe to Legal AF. I am here with my colleague, Sean Wilentz of Princeton University. Sean, while Donald Trump is wandering around the Middle East, the ICE agents are wandering around American cities trying to find the enemy within. Um, and Trump will come back soon. Stephen Miller, I see, is not on Air Force One in the Middle East. He's still here, overseeing our various purges and putches and so on.
Right.
Um,
He's doing his job, which is basically the domestic president of the United States. And that's what he does.
yeah, but you know, people think that history started yesterday, but there's a lot behind it, and there are a lot of incidents. I mean, George Floyd seems like a long time ago, doesn't it?
Well, it does, but there was a history beside that. Many people thought that George Floyd was the beginning of history, that terrible murder and all the events coming from it. And there is a continuity with today, no question. But there were earlier incidents as well. I mean, going back to the beginning of the country, but one that particularly struck me, urban violence, was what happened in Los Angeles. The Rodney King beating. I mean, he wasn't killed, but he was very badly, and it was all caught on video. That's really the point here,
You
is
know,
that these
that
things
all
now
led.
are there.
Donald Trump has talked about invoking the Insurrection Act. The last
Yeah,
time it was invoked was
right,
in Los Angeles as a consequence of what happened with Rodney King.
right.
And we have with us an author of a book about that whole period of time and this author was a central character in it. The book is called Liberals with Attitude, the Rodney King Beating and the Fight for the Soul of Los Angeles. It's very relevant to what we're going through today. And the author is a legend. He has had a storied career, and among his many accomplishments, including half a dozen books, of which this is the latest, he has produced the soundtrack of our lives. Danny Goldberg, who is now the president of Gold Village Entertainment, has worked in the music business since the 60s. And he goes all the way back. He was the head of Atlantic Records. He was the head of Warner Brothers Records. He was the head of Mercury Records. And he has worked with just about everybody. His clients have included, people from the bands of Nirvana to Bonnie Raitt, the Allman Brothers, Ricky Lee Jones, you name it. He's worked with them. And he's now written this incredible book. And it's really the story of LA Confidential, brought up to the 90s. It's the sequel, and it asks the questions that we're facing today. How provocative policies produce blood on the street that authoritarians want to justify themselves, and then how can change happen? How can these kinds of authoritarian figures who do have deeply rooted power be dealt with? And this is the story that Danny is telling in his book, Liberals with Attitude. So, welcome, Danny.
Thank you. Good to be on with you guys.
Yeah. So, this is a story of incredible characters who were giants in their time, particularly in Los Angeles. And they were known nationally. And we need to bring them back and bring them to life so people understand. There were heroes, there were villains. One of the chief villain, I guess, is the chief of of police in Los Angeles, Daryl Gates, and he's he was somebody who believed that offenders ought to be taken out and shot, as he said, we're in a war.
Casual drug users should be
Casual drug users. That would include a lot of people in Los Angeles.
a lot of at least one person on this podcast. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, he also made a remark that resonates with our time. He said blacks might be more likely to die from chokeholds because their arteries don't open as fast as they do in normal people.
Right.
So this Daryl Gates, he's a very powerful guy, and explain to us his power and Daryl Gates in this period.
Well, starting in the late 1930s, the Los Angeles Police Department was completely autonomous, or virtually autonomous from the rest of city government. It was originally some reform measure dealing in the wake of a corrupt mayor, but it was adapted immediately by the guy who wrote the new language, William Parker, who was chief for 17 years. James Ellroy, the author of L.A. Confidential, was obsessed with Parker and used him in 5 of his books as a character. And Parker was a very efficient administrator and a virulent racist. He literally would not say the word Negro, and he prohibited black and white officers from riding in the same car together. In 1950, a young cadet from the police academy named Daryl Gates became his driver. And he and Parker, who did not have a son of his own, saw Gates as the son he never had, and groomed him to be chief. And Gates finally rose quickly through the ranks of the LAPD. He was the commander in charge of the response to the 1965 Watts riots, among other things, and he became chief in the late 1970s. In addition to being protected by a city charter that made it literally impossible to fire the police chief, in Warren Christopher's memoir, he said the LA police chief was a job for life until the reforms happened. Christopher studied the LAPD after the Rodney King beating and made some recommendations. Gates also was very charismatic. He was good with the media. He foreshadowed a lot of Donald Trump's characteristics. Besides being a racist, he was telegenic. He was vicious. He made up nicknames for his opponents. He called my friend and mentor Ramona Ripston, who ran the ACLU in LA during this period, Ramona Ripoff. He would have police cars follow around reporters that were critical of him to intimidate them. And he had a unit of 80 policemen who were in something that was called the Organized Crime Task Force that never did anything about organized crime or the mafia, and spent all of their energy getting personal information, private information on local elected officials, business leaders, and celebrities. This is not some fantasy of the ACLU. A former sergeant who was ordered personally by Gates to spy on former Governor Jerry Brown, among other people, wrote a book about it, former Sergeant Mike Rothmiller. And in 30-some years since the book came out, not a word of it has ever been repudiated. So he was an intimidating character, and he understood how to wield the office of police chief to keep his support in the community at a time when there was a crack epidemic and gang warfare. So politicians were afraid of him and rarely confronted him about anything, despite a legacy of racist comments like the ones that you quoted before, and running a department that made Black and Latino neighborhoods feel like they were occupied by a foreign power.
Yeah, LA. We think of LA now as the center of the left coast. And liberalism and so on in Hollywood. But LA was for a long time the center of reaction in America. And Los Angeles Times was a very reactionary newspaper. It was an anti-labor town. Ronald Reagan, came out of this environment.
And Nixon was
too.
preacher of the LA Times.
Yeah. And it was deeply racist. It was anti-Semitic. The Jews were not allowed into the Gentile country clubs, as we know.
Yeah.
And it was also anti-Latino.
Oh yeah, it was the LAPD was equally difficult to in Latino neighborhoods as black neighborhoods at the time of the Rodney King beating. No question about that. And it was a segregated city until the late '60s. There were housing covenants. I mean, Mayor Bradley, who was the mayor when the Rodney King beating happened, first black mayor of LA,
Tom Bradley,
Tom Bradley,
former policeman, black policeman.
he had been an officer on the LAPD. Him and Gates had known each other for 4 decades and had hated each other every day of those 4 decades. When he wanted to buy a house, he had a white person buy it and then give it to Bradley because there were housing covenants that prohibited blacks from intimidated people into selling their homes to black people. So it had the liberal image of Hollywood, and it had a dark reality for people of color, particularly in poor neighborhoods, particularly when they dealt with the police department. And, when Rodney King was beaten up, Daryl Gates said it was an aberration. And at a rally 2 weeks later, Jesse Jackson said the aberration wasn't the beating, it was the video. Because camcorders were brand new. It was the first time white people had ever seen anything like that.
Yes. Tell us about the incident of the video and the camcorder and the shock of that before we bring in your own role, because you played an important role here with the ACLU in the community, and our hero who's going to enter soon after you tell us about
our mutual
tell us about the Rodney King episode.
Rodney, it was in March of 1991, and by coincidence, on the day that the beating happened, Daryl Gates was in Washington, D.C., where President George H.W. Bush honored him at a War on Drugs conference and called him an all-American hero. At that very time, Rodney King, a black 30-something Los Angeles resident, was speeding, was chased for speeding by the Highway Patrol. Tests later showed he'd had more than he should have to drink. He was pulled over, and up until then, the police were doing their job. They then called in other police cars, and 4 LAPD officers beat him 50-something times with metal batons while he writhed on the ground in pain, while 20 other officers watched. It so happened that an apartment building overlooking the area that Rodney King was beaten in lived a plumber named George Holliday, who had just gotten a camcorder for his birthday and had never used it before. Camcorder was the first low-cost home video thing that was also portable. Now we do it on our phones. In those days, it was a tremendous novelty, and the price point had just dropped under $1,000. And he videotaped the beating. Meanwhile, the timing of the beating was 3 days after the end of the Gulf War. And CNN had risen to popularity based on 24/7 coverage of the Gulf War. They had nothing to show anymore because the war was over. And so the video was shown, the Rodney King beating video was shown dozens and dozens of times. Other TV networks picked it up. And a few weeks later, a poll showed that more than 70% of all Americans and more than 90% of people in LA had seen the video. And 90% of those who saw it felt that the police were excessively brutal. And nobody in LA thought that if it was a white man driving and pulled over, that he would have been treated that way. It was impossible to separate Rodney King's race from the beating. He went to the hospital, many broken bones, a fractured skull, and so on. He was never charged with a crime. They did release him after he was released. And the exposure of the video galvanized a discussion in LA about the behavior of the LAPD in general. And people like the American Civil Liberties Union and their supporters and Congresswoman Maxine Waters, who had long been calling for Gates to leave, had a new tool. And most importantly, Mayor Bradley, who had avoided direct confrontations with Gates because he didn't like battles that he couldn't win, finally saw a chance to get rid of Gates. Bradley was no liberal. He was a centrist, what people would call a corporate Democrat. He supported Walter.
Very business oriented.
Very business oriented, very close to the business community. In 1984, when Maxine Waters was co-chair of the Jesse Jackson campaign, Bradley endorsed Walter Mondale and was actually on the short list for VP that year. He was risk averse, played it close to the vest, but he knew that his legacy depended on how he responded to this. He had long been criticized by some in the Black community for not confronting Gates, but he saw that because of the ubiquity of the video, the political calculus had changed, and there was now a real majority that wanted to do something to prevent future beatings like that. But it was still very, very difficult. Gates did not want to leave. He never wanted to leave. His mentor, right, Chief Parker, had died on the job, and that was Gates's intention also. And he was in very good shape. He ran the marathon. He was only in his 60s. He could see another 10, 15 years in power. Mm-hmm. And it took 16 months to get rid of him. And that's what the book is about, is how Bradley created a left-center coalition to finally overcome the institutional power that Gates had, the intimidating power of any police chief on politicians, all of whom have constituents worried about crime, and the particular kind of power that Gates had because of the secret police that he had getting information, and because of the legal structure that made him very hard to dislodge.
Yeah, you were involved in this. You were an official, besides doing everything else, besides being head of Atlantic Records and all of their subsidiary labels. You were in the ACLU at the time there.
Well, at that time, I was senior vice president of Atlantic, so I hadn't moved to New York yet to become president. But I had an avocation, which is through our mutual friend, Stanley Scheinbaum, who's a major character in the book, and I'm sure you'll want to talk about. He had been the chair of the ACLU for 10 years. He had gotten involved. He had funded the Daniel Ellsberg Defense Fund in LA, and he then became ACLU chair because he saw how they reacted to those issues. His money came from his wife, whose original name was Betty Warner, the daughter of Harry Warner of the Warner Brothers. So she was a movie heiress, and she was to the left of Stanley, and the two of them were close friends with Norman Lear, and they were part of what the media in LA called the Malibu Mafia, even though Stanley himself lived in Brentwood, and was a big funder of all sorts of progressive activity. And Stanley had this idea that I should take on his former role at the ACLU and be chair of the ACLU Foundation of Southern California, which I was thrilled at the suggestion, a role I started playing in 1987. So by 91, when the King beating happened, I had worked with the local ACLU for several years and was totally enamored of and I knew how involved they were with police brutality. They had full-time people in the office, a police brutality hotline. They won millions of dollars every year in lawsuits against the LAPD for brutality. I mean, former, and Major League Baseball stars and basketball stars both sued them for, because they were just accosted by LAPD because they were black.
I remember Joe Morgan.
Joe Morgan won a $500,000 lawsuit against the LAPD. He was tackled and placed on the ground in a LAX, and they said they got him mixed up with somebody else they were looking for. But they held him for an hour, and Tim tried to threaten him if he went public with it, and but that was one of many, many such lawsuits. So yeah, I was ACLU chair, and I've been educated by them about the fact that the cops that were so nice to me in the nice neighborhood that I lived in were not so nice to people who lived in poor neighborhoods who were a different color. And I really had a front row seat for this coordinated effort to change the police department there, and I just thought it would be fun to write a book to honor these heroic figures who have been largely lost to history, but who I really admire.
I knew Stanley well as well. And tell us more about Stanley. I was interested in your book to learn that Joan Didion was fascinated by Stanley and wanted to write a book called The Good American. And she about Stanley and conducted a number of interviews that have not been published. But tell us about Stanley and his background, and because Stanley becomes the prime mover here.
Well, it was a there was something still exists in Los Angeles called the Police Commission, which is the members are appointed by the mayor and then have to be confirmed by the Los Angeles City Council. And it has some administrative oversight over the police chief. It couldn't fire him or really sanction him, but it had some budgetary and approval, some policy approval. And the chief had to meet with the police commission once a week. And those meetings were on Tuesdays. And I spoke to an officer who was Gates's former driver, who told me that a bunch of the guys made up T-shirts for Gates that said, "I hate Tuesdays," because he hated so much having to confront Stanley Scheinbaum on a weekly basis during this time. Yeah, Bradley put Stanley as president of the police commission at the same time that he asked Warren Christopher, who was very different politically than Stanley. Christopher was a mainstream Democrat. He would be named Secretary of State by your former boss, Bill Clinton, the following year, and was involved with the transition committee and the vice presidential search committee, and was the biggest corporate lawyer in LA. He was when he first was asked to have a commission about the beating, my ACLU friends were not optimistic because he had been complicit in a 65 report about the Watts riot that exonerated the LAPD. But in my research, I learned that Christopher had a considerable amount of remorse about having let the LAPD off the hook. He was close to Bradley. And even though he was very busy with the Bill Clinton campaign, he made the time to have this commission and to stay involved for another 6 months to make sure that the ballot initiative changing the city charter passed. So Christopher kind of dealt with the business community and the moderates. Stanley was there day-to-day combat with Gates, trying to make him hate his job more than he loved it, and keeping the left activated. And similarly, the ACLU was involved, but also the next mayor, Richard Riordan, who was a Republican conservative, ended up being converted by Christopher and Bradley to go from being a friend of Gates to somebody asking him to step down. So it was a pretty interesting coalition, but Scheinbaum was right at the center of it and had the most direct personal confrontations with Gates on a weekly basis of any of the people. Bradley and Gates didn't speak for the year between the Rodney King beating and the riots. You know, they hated each other so much. Really a healthy situation when the mayor and the police chief don't talk.
Yeah, now where do the rappers fit into all of this?
Yeah,
well, the rappers were living with this. So, you know, there was a group that became very popular in the late 80s called N with Attitude. And their biggest song, can I use profanity on this podcast?
Absolutely.
Their biggest song was called Fuck the Police. Right. And it was not about police in general. It was about the LAPD specifically. And Daryl Gates himself was mentioned in 15 different hip hop lyrics. And this whole genre of what the music media called gangster rap all came from LA. People like Dr. Dre and Ice Cube and Ice-T, all of whom rose to fame on raps about how horrible the LAPD was in their neighborhoods. So that was sort of a cultural counterpoint to the political battle.
Mm-hmm. Tell us, you were at Atlantic then.
Yeah.
And did you played a role in getting some of this stuff recorded?
Well, I was really not, my background in music is primarily rock and roll. When I was a record executive, I had other people I worked as colleagues with who understood rap and hip hop. I wish I had the musical intelligence to tune into it. I could have owned a bigger house now, like like some of my friends did. But rock and roll is good to me. So, but I was an ardent free speech guy. The way I got involved originally, the way I met Stanley Scheinbaum was because I opposed Tipper Gore when she wanted to have a rating system for lyrics similar to movie ratings. And when the FBI wrote a letter to NWA's record company suggesting that they withdraw the record from circulation because it was demoralizing to police forces, I was able to be quoted as the ACLU chair, saying this is not okay for a government agency to try to basically censor music. And the FBI letter did inspire local police forces around the country to shut down NWA concerts. So it wasn't like they were just criticizing the record, which is fine. If police criticize a song called Fuck the Police, I wouldn't blame them. You know, the difference between criticism and trying to shut something down. You know, that's so yeah, hip hop was there, and I had friends who were very involved. I mean, the big hip hop label at that time affiliated with Atlantic was Interscope. But later they moved to another corporate home, and they put out the Dr. Dre Chronic album and Snoop Dogg's first albums. And I did introduce Maxine Waters to some of to Snoop Dogg. One of my
well, that's important. But so there were connections. I mean, it wasn't just
so there was an understanding that they were the voice of the community, and the black politicians from those areas, whether it was state assembly people or Maxine Waters or others, understood that that was the voice of their own community because they were otherwise voiceless. A lot of the liberal politicians that would normally be kind of on our side were terrified of alienating Gates and only came very, very late to the battle against him because they didn't want to be have their personal secrets revealed, and they didn't want to be accused of being soft on crime. So
he was a little J. Edgar Hoover too. He had all this.
Oh no, it was completely patterned on J. Edgar Hoover, and it was very intimidating and effective. You know, the early '90s still. It was there were no publicly gay politicians in the early '90s. You know, pot was not legal in the early '90s. You know, these were career-ending things.
Yeah.
So how did you do it? What happened? I mean, how did you get him undone?
So there's a trial that takes place of the cops who beat Rodney King, and it was moved to Simi Valley.
Right. So Sean said something, you said something. Let me answer Sean's quickly and then answer yours in more long. Bradley realized that the key was to keep public interest in the Rodney King situation and in the racist side of Daryl Gates, that it was bad for business, bad for the moral tone of the community. Typically when these things happen, even George Floyd, they fade from the headlines quickly, and the institutional players hold on to their power. And that's what happened after George Floyd. There was, as you know, no national legislation despite all of those protests. So Bradley understood that he needed to get a supermajority in the city that would influence enough of the city council to stay opposed to this. And the whole strategy had to do with getting different people, including the people we've mentioned, to keep the process going and to keep it in the headlines for those 16 months, which he successfully did. The trial came about 3/4 of the way through the story and was incredibly important, as you said. The 4 officers who beat Rodney King were indicted for police brutality. Then their defense attorneys said that they couldn't get a fair trial in LA because everyone was biased because they'd seen the video. And a judge bought into that argument, even though change of venue was very rare in California at the time. For example, the Manson family, they didn't have a change of venue for that, you know. But a judge bought into the idea that there might be some bias by people who had seen the video a million times and who lived in the community. And so it was assigned to another judge. His last name is Weisberg. I'm spacing out on his first name, but it's in the book accurately. And he, for reasons that he never explained, decided to move it to Simi Valley. There were several different locations he could have done it in. And Alameda County was one, Orange County, but he chose Ventura County, and within Ventura County, he chose Simi Valley. Simi Valley is known for a couple of things that are relevant to this. Number one, 98% white. Number two, it's where enormous thousands of retired LAPD officers and their families and thousands of and hundreds of current LAPD officers lived. It couldn't be a jury pool more biased against Rodney King. And the judge never explained why he did it. In Warren Christopher's memoir, he suggested that it was because it was a short commute from where the judge lived. I believe that it was inappropriate influence by supporters of Daryl Gates getting it moved. I can't prove it, but the judge was never willing to answer anybody's question about why he moved it there. So the black community, and there were people also in the DA's office and at the ACLU, all predicted that the officers would probably be acquitted by that jury, and that's what happened. Gates had been informed of the verdict hours before it was made public, and it was known that the jury was deliberating several days before it was public. And again, a lot of the people certainly the police commissioners, all said, "Hey, look, what are the preparations in case it's a not guilty verdict and there's a disturbance?" And Gates assured them that he had a plan. It turned out he either didn't have a plan or he had a very nefarious plan. Again, historians disagree. I'll tell you my opinion, but one thing is for sure, that as the riots were breaking out, he's walking out of Parker Center, which is where the police, to this day, the police headquarters of the LAPD is called Parker Center, named after Gates's mentor, Bill Parker. And Scheinbaum sees him walking in. He says, "Where are you going? There's like a riot starting." And Gates says, "Oh, I have to do something. I'll be back." And what he had to do was go to a fundraiser that was about an hour drive away from downtown LA. It was in the Brentwood section of LA, ironically, where Stanley Scheinbaum lived. And it was a fundraiser to oppose a ballot initiative that would change the city charter, that would require Daryl Gates to leave because it had term limits for police chiefs of 10 years, and he'd already been in for 13. And would create an accountability structure in LA that was similar to every other American city. And Gates opposed that, and he had said that he viewed that the public's opinion on that ballot initiative would indicate whether or not they wanted him to stay on as chief. So even though he'd been repeatedly saying he would leave, he then would say he wasn't leaving. And he was betting everything after a series of, he kept moving the goalposts because every criteria he gave indicated that he should leave. So even when he came back from the fundraiser hours later, he was, by all reports, completely disengaged. And when I say by all reports, I don't mean a bunch of lefties. I mean that William Webster, the former head of the CIA and FBI, did an investigation of the riots, and he determined that Gates was completely disengaged. And he didn't have any police response in many of the most troubled neighborhoods.
How widespread were the riots? How big were they? What was going on?
They were huge. I think 60 people were killed. It was over $1 billion worth of damage. There was a disproportionate amount of damage in Korean neighborhoods because there'd been this other tragedy in the city of a teenage black girl being shot to death by a Korean shop owner who then was given no jail time, shot in the back, I might say. And all of the sports events were canceled for 5 days. Concerts were canceled. The city was really under siege. And the Insurrection Act was used. But the difference between it being used then and what's being talked about now is that the governor and the mayor asked the president to send in the National Guard.
Right.
And there really was a riot. I mean, there really was not an insurrection.
It was a real life riot. It was, again, 60 people killed and billions of dollars worth of damage. And the city,
a lot of fires, a lot of arson.
Yeah, arson, a lot,
destruction of property, beatings.
So, it's unknowable why the police response was so weak the first 24 hours. Again, Gates kept giving different answers as to why it was. Initially, he said, well, the police were inhibited from enforcing the law because...
What is your view, Danny?
My view is that Gates intentionally didn't respond because in 1965, after the Watts riots, the popularity of the LA police chief went up. And I think that he knew that the ballot initiative, his position on the ballot initiative was losing in the polls by 7 or 8 points. It ended up losing by 30 points and losing on a 2-to-1 basis because the public didn't sympathize with him. They felt he was complicit in this. And so first he said that it was that, they didn't want to be videotaped beating someone up, which was ridiculous. No one ever said the police should never use force. They just said you should have 20 policemen surrounding 4 other policemen beating a helpless, unarmed guy. They didn't say that there's no force when there's violent crime at hand. Then he said it was a sergeant's fault on Normandy Street, sergeant said he was ordered to stand down. Then he said he was depressed because his son Scott had just OD'd. He had a son who was a drug addict and had OD'd, but Gates hadn't spoken to his son for years. He believed that was tough love. Not that it's so easy to have a drug addict in the family. And I sympathize with that. But this kid, his son had been a drug addict for many, many years. Gates had never indicated it interfered with his performance of his duties before. So, and then the commission, again, partially blamed him. I feel he may have thought it was a Hail Mary pass to let the riot get more out of control and create sympathy for his leadership.
Which then led to the invocation of the Insurrection Act and the federalized troops come in.
Yeah. But fortunately, Bradley and Martin Christopher and Scheinbaum had laid the groundwork for so many months that instead of making him more popular, it made him less popular. And the ballot initiative passed by a 2-to-1 margin. And 6 weeks later, Gates was forced finally to resign. But the key fulcrum point was, from a legal point of view, was the passage of the ballot initiative, because it then put some legal teeth into the idea that it was time for Gates to go. And that was Warren Christopher's genius to frame it that way.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So the conclusion is that Gates gets forced out, but there's enormous destruction that takes place. But there had to be a political coalition from across the board, including a moderate Republican, where Tom Bradley does this as well. Stanley Scheinbaum on the police.
Maxine Waters, Michael Zinzin, a former Black Panther who was a community organizer. So Dick Riordan.
So there has to be
Dr. Dre right in the middle of all of that. It's great.
Yeah, and Dr. Dre is and you've got the rappers, and it's who are telling the world what's going on. Really.
Yeah, exactly. And Chuck D called rap the CNN of the ghetto.
Right.
There's some countervailing power that has to be organized in order to deal with an authoritarian who actually wants blood in the streets.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, look, again, the book is riddled with quotes from Daryl Gates. You mentioned the most famous one where he said the arteries of blacks were different from those of normal people, but there's 25 other or 30 other grotesque incidents. And he had been impervious up until then because people were just so scared of crime, and a lot of white people just looked the other way. And the challenge was to motivate white moderates to support the ACLU and the black community, and create so much of a supermajority that the city council members who otherwise kowtowed to Daryl Gates thought that they had more to lose by supporting him than to gain by supporting him. And that was because I give a lot of the credit to Bradley for understanding the need to create a left-center coalition. And I give credit to Stanley and Ramon Rifton of the ACLU to understanding they needed to focus narrowly on the agenda of getting rid of the racist police chief and changing the city charter, and not trying to commingle it with 20 of other issues where people on the left and the center disagreed.
Right.
And I think in that respect, because the fear of crime is still so much behind some of the whole hysteria about immigration and the idea of sending, the army into American cities, I think that the psychological conditions of dealing with white moderates are quite similar from the early 90s to now, even though obviously the internet has changed everything and media has changed and politics has changed things. The psychology is still not that different on fighting fear with rationality and coalition building. And in that instance, both the left and the center were grown-ups and did the right thing. And we could use a little more of that right now. I mean, particularly as a guy who's doing this from New York City, where we have a pretty exciting candidate for mayor who's not been endorsed by the Democratic, even though he won a Democratic primary, not been endorsed by either the Democratic head of the U.S. Senate or the House, both of whom live in New York City, is not a good sign. And then, of course, there's crazy people on the left who also don't help.
Yeah. Well, so there are a lot of lessons that you offer in this book. This is really a case study for our time Liberals with Attitude by Danny Goldberg. Thanks for being with us on the Court of History, Danny. And on behalf of Sean Wilentz of Princeton, the Court of History is now adjourned.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.